Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Understanding CBD. I'm your host, Stephen Wallman, here today with a fantastic guest, as always. We only bring the best guests here on Understanding CBD. Today's topic, the guest we have is Robert Thomas. He's an analytical chemist. What is this? I'm hearing myself here. That's interesting. I can hear myself here as a delay. Maybe that's on your side, Robert. Let me.
Well, what?
I'm hearing, hey, Robert, welcome to the show. I'm hearing an echo on my screen here when I'm talking, but do you hear that?
I hear something in the background.
Check, check. I muted my computer. Let me see. You hear an echo. I'm hearing this here. This is going to be annoying for me. Do you hear it twice?
No.
No? Okay. I'm going to have to just deal with my voice twice, and I'll do as little bit of talking as possible.
You
But let
can
me do
you
another introduction here for you, Robert.
okay.
An analytical chemist for 50 years, principal consultant at Scientific Solutions, an author of the book. You know what it might be? Hang on a second. Let me check my sound settings.
There's nothing obvious my end, Steve, so I don't
Yeah,
know.
it might be on my side. Let me okay. Let's see. Is that any better?
I can only hear you once. I can't hear anything behind you.
Yeah, this is really annoying for me. I'm hearing.
You're still hearing it?
Yes. Let's see how. Sometimes lives can have this frustration here. Let me
Okay, would you like me to go out and come back in? Do you think that would help?
let me see if I leave the studio. Maybe it'll be me. Hold on. All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right.
Is
All
that
right.
better?
I had another window open that I was actually listening to my live stream as I was recording. So
Oh my God. Okay. All right. Well, I'm
we
glad it
got
wasn't
that
me.
sorted out. This is the beauty of live. Sorry for everyone. We wasted about 4 minutes, but if we can, I'd like to give another introduction to you, just so we can edit it later for future. There's normally more people that watch the recording than they do watch it live. So
Okay.
I'm gonna just do like a start over here and appreciate the patience here. So anyway, welcome. We are live. This is Understanding CBD. My name is Stephen Wallman, and I am your host today from Wallman's Apothecary. We have a fantastic guest this morning, depending on when you're listening. His name is Robert Thomas. He's an analytical chemist and has been for over 50 years, principal consultant at Scientific Solutions, and author of the book, Measuring Heavy Metal Contaminants in Cannabis and Hemp. So without any further ado, Robert, let me introduce you to the show and the guests and the group.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning again. First question for you, Robert, and it's really after 50 years as an analytical chemist, I can't imagine you've been studying cannabis and hemp the whole time. How did you get into that cannabis and hemp, and really when was that?
Yeah, I actually surprised myself when I ventured into the industry. I worked for a large analytical instrumentation company for over 25 years, initially in the UK, and then they transferred me to the US in 1987. And I worked in the field of mass spectrometry, which is a very sensitive technique for measuring small amounts of atoms or molecules. Anyway, I did a lot of work in the pharmaceutical, environmental, and industrial space. That's where I established my credibility, so to speak. And then I took early retirement from that company in early 2000s, and I got into the field of consulting and science writing. And it gave me the opportunity to write articles and papers, and I actually work with a lot of scientific journals and got a number of writing contracts. Anyway, it led to my first book, Practical Guide to ICP-MS, in mid-2000s. And then I was also doing a lot of work at the American Chemical Society. I was the heavy metal expert on the ACS Reagent Chemicals Committee. And we did a lot of work with the United States Pharmacopoeia when they were changing heavy metal regulations for pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, for 100 years, the pharmaceutical industry just monitored one heavy metal, which was lead. And it was a colorimetric test, a very simple test, which relied on looking at the color of the sample and comparing it with a lead standard. Well, that test was initiated in 1908. So in the early 2000s, they decided they wanted to update that method to include modern instrumental techniques. And they used the technique which I specialized in, which was inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. So with the ACS, we worked very closely with the United States Pharmacopoeia, who developed elemental impurity regulations for pharmaceuticals and drug products. At that time, I saw an opportunity to write a book, which I did, measuring elemental impurities in pharmaceuticals. One of my contacts at the United States Pharmacopoeia suggested that I should take a look at the cannabis industry, particularly with regard to heavy metals. So I had just finished a book, so I was hesitant to get involved, but they gave me some contact names. I started calling around and talking to lots of people, and I realized the industry did not have a good understanding of sources of heavy metals in cannabis consumer products. So I really felt that I could apply my expertise to get a better understanding of that, and possibly writing some publications and maybe a long-term goal of writing a book. So that was in 2019, and I slowly got to understand the industry. And then I wrote my first book on heavy metals in cannabis in 2020, and that came out in 2021. So that was my background and why I became involved in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, thank you. It's a second career for you. It seems like,
it is my second career. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and maybe third.
Well, you're right. Who knows what it'll take me?
Yeah, well, thank you for doing the work that you're in, because it's something that's very misunderstood and really most people don't understand it. So I'd like to, if we can, just if you could give us a basic understanding of what are heavy metals and why is it a risk? Why do we need to identify them?
Okay. Heavy metals. Obviously, if you look at the periodic table, you can look at a group of heavy metals, which are typically lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, which are the most toxic of the heavy metals. But there are a number of other heavy metals which are equally as toxic, but they kind of get forgotten because lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury have over the years become the most studied heavy metals. And certainly in the pharmaceutical industry and environmental monitoring, those elements are by far the most common ones which are monitored. So the reason that they're toxic is because heavy metals, once they're absorbed into the bloodstream, whether it's through digestion or through in the environment, they get into the bloodstream, and they can. The thing about heavy metals is they readily cross the blood-brain barrier, and they cause all sorts of cognitive damage. And that was the reason that they were the most important with regard to the environment and pharmaceuticals, is because if people with compromised immune systems are taking drugs or drug products, you clearly have to know how much heavy metals are present in that drug. And the problem with the pharmaceutical industry is that there are many sources of heavy metals from the raw materials. For example, drug products typically have additives or materials that are bound with the API to make them easier to digest, to make them easier to get into your bloodstream. Well, many of those compounds are dug out of the ground, excipients, for example. And if you dig anything out of the ground, there's a high likelihood that it's going to have high levels of heavy metals. So you always have to be observant about what material goes into a product. So when we come to the cannabis industry, cannabis and hemp are typically or mainly grown outdoors nowadays. And with the legalization of hemp, we know that the majority of hemp is grown outdoors. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of thought gone into where hemp is being grown. And because of the industrial activity in the US over the past few decades, particularly mining and industrial activities like metal smelting, the dangers of being heavy metals in the soil is quite high. So what happens is cannabis and hemp are known as hyperaccumulators. They can absorb high levels of heavy metals without impacting their own health. And it's good to understand that cannabis and hemp are also used to remediate soil. So if a soil has been contaminated for whatever reason, they can plant cannabis and hemp to absorb the heavy metal out of the soil and clean up the soil. An example of this is in the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in the Ukraine in 1986, where there was a meltdown. In the decades after that, they planted industrial hemp to clean up the soil of the radionuclides and the heavy metals. So we know that hemp is a natural accumulator of heavy metals. Unfortunately, when hemp is grown for cannabis consumer products, you have to plant it in soil which ideally is not contaminated. But because of what's happening in the cannabis industry nowadays, often there's not a great deal of thought going in to where the cannabis and hemp is planted. And once it's been absorbed from the soil, it readily gets absorbed into the shoots, into the leaves, and then eventually into the flower. Even though extraction will reduce the heavy metal level in the extract, you can concentrate it when you purify the extract further down the line. So that's the problem.
Got it. So you mentioned the outdoor grown. I'm in Maryland. I know you are as well. It's interesting.
Yep.
A lot of the licensed medical cannabis programs do grow indoors. Is that eliminate the problem from?
It doesn't totally eliminate the problem because I mean you can obviously use a cleaner grow medium, and obviously indoors you have more control over what medium you use. You don't have to use soil. You can use special grow mediums which have been developed for cannabis and hemp. However, you've got to look very critically at your nutrient, at your fertilizer, and even at the water, because we know that some fertilizers which are made which are made from phosphates. Phosphate is made from phosphate rock. Phosphate rock is dug out of the ground. So unless it's a high quality, high purity fertilizer, could possibly have high levels of transition and heavy metals. And if you're using a fertilizer which is not particularly clean, you obviously transfer those contaminant levels of heavy metals into the plant. And the same with water. You've got to make sure that your water is clean, even though you assume it. Obviously, the EPA regulates drinking water, but sometimes drinking water is not used to water plants. It can be sort of recirculated water that's cleaned up from sewage systems. So we know that the water can play a role in it, but certainly the chances of heavy metal contamination are much lower with plants which are grown indoors, but still, it can't be ruled out.
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of questions I have. So let's take cannabis aside for a moment, because it's often where I'd be talking with someone about, using and incorporating cannabis into their lifestyle, as they're at a fair eating a fried donut and
Right.
not consuming healthy food, and then they're really concerned about the cleanliness of the cannabis. What kind of risks are there in our regular food supply for heavy metals and water food supply? Is that a big concern?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. We know wherever you plant anything, crops, grains, fruit, or whatever, the chances are that they will absorb heavy metals. We are because of the industrial activity over the past few decades. There's a lot of contaminated land within the US, and it's unfortunate. And we know that, for example, rice that's grown in the southern states in the US, because the nature of rice, it's grown in flooded fields. And what happens is that the heavy metals are not only in the soil, but they get into the water where the rice is grown. Unfortunately, the FDA does not regulate plant material that's used for foods. So things like broccoli, peppers, corn, there is no heavy metal regulations for those raw materials that is grown for consumption by consumers. Unfortunately, it's a sad state of affairs, but the only time the FDA starts to seriously regulate heavy metals in processed food is when it's being used for infants or babies. And there recently have been strict regulations which the FDA have come out with for heavy metals in baby food. And that's good. But for years, there weren't really strict regulations for heavy metals in baby foods. And a number of years ago, the FDA got their knuckles wrapped by Congress because there was a report in Consumer Report, funny enough, which was done independently, which came out with a scathing report about the quality of processed foods in general, not just baby food. So Congress got hold of this, started investigating, and then they wrote a congressional report which basically told the FDA to get their act together. And they were given a number of years to do that, but recently the FDA came out with brand new regulations for processed infant food. So in reality, the problem is there. No matter what is grown in the US, there's the potential for absorbing heavy metals. But one point to emphasize is that medical cannabis is consumed by people often with compromised immune systems, and sometimes they're administering it by vaping carts. So the point is that if you have heavy metals in your flower, which is then transferred to the cannabinoid of choice, if that medical cannabis product is vaped or is consumed on a regular basis, say every day, by someone who's using it for sleep or for stress, obviously it's a little bit different to consuming maybe broccoli a couple of times a week. So it's all about what is the intended use, and clearly cannabis is a medical product. So you have to be super diligent about what heavy metals are getting into those medical products.
Yeah, so it sounds like they're part of an earth element. So you're not going to eliminate heavy
That's
metals
absolutely,
in our world.
absolutely.
It sounds like that dose might be the poison, is limiting the the opportunity for exposure to these. And that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense, Robert. So you mentioned vaping, and I'd like to kind of put that on hold for a little bit. But in the life cycle of a heavy metal, because people hear about or I read about mercury in fish and in animals, and with cannabis being a bioaccumulator and pulling in these heavy metals, the Chernobyl example, once it pulls it into the cannabis plant, what happens afterwards? Does it is there a safe way to handle this plant that does have heavy metals so it doesn't continue that cycle and getting recycled back into the environment? What do they do with it once it's been identified in an element?
Well, every state has its own regulations for heavy metals in the plant. I mean, every state's different, and I think that's the problem with the regulatory system of cannabis in the US. It's done by state. There's no federal oversight. So each state can decide how to regulate the plant and how to regulate consumer products. And every state is slightly different. But assuming that the state regulations for heavy metals in the plant are at a certain level, and they're pretty low, they're down at part per million levels. And as an analytical chemist, you're dealing with part per million, part per billion, part per trillion. And it's very difficult to get that concept across. But the heavy metal regulations for in the cannabis plant, in the cannabis flower, are very similar to heavy metal regulations for orally delivered pharmaceutical products. And they're typically down at lead, for example, is 0.5 of ppm. Well, that sounds low, 0.5 part per million. But the point is that if that 0.5 part per million in the plant, if that is extracted, there's a good chance that you won't extract all of it, because heavy metals are not readily available. Not readily soluble in organic solvents, but you will extract some of it. The problem is that lead will then get concentrated further down the purification line. So once it's in there, it's very difficult to remediate. There are ways of doing that, but they're extremely expensive. And as long as it's below the state, the state-driven regulated limit, if it's below 0.5 ppm, that's fine. But very often what happens, that can get concentrated further down the line. And that's just one element. There's the possibility also in the manufacturing process of picking up other non-regulated metals. Unfortunately, most of the states in the US only regulate the big four. And for the past few years, I've tried to help them better understand that there's more elements potentially can get into the cannabis plant in the cultivation and growing process that are outside the big four, things like chromium, nickel, iron, copper. And some of those elements are potential contaminants in the production process. For example, if the cannabinoid is in regular contact with stainless steel, what happens with stainless steel? It gets old. And even though stainless steel you think is corrosion resistant, what happens when it gets old? You get corrosion sites. And what happens is that the cannabinoid is slightly acidic. For example, THC is a pH of about 5 to 6, so it's only slightly acidic, but it slowly corrodes the sites on the stainless steel and can leach out the chromium, nickel, and sometimes iron. And then that gets into the consumer product further into the production. That's one area. Another area is the use of plastic and glass. We know that cheap plastic is used quite a lot in the cannabis industry, and it's not really the right quality for storage or delivery of products. And we know that from the pharmaceutical industry, which is highly regulates the quality of glass, so you can only use certain glass for certain applications, the cannabis industry does not have that regulations. So I recently published an article about what the cannabis industry should know about glass. And it was, I got a huge amount of response because people didn't understand that unless the right quality of glass is used, there's a strong likelihood, particularly if the cannabinoid product has been stored for long periods in that glass product, it can leach out the heavy metals and transition metals from the glass. And it becomes a problem. And that gets multiplied when you put it into a vaping device, because what happens, not only do you get corrosion of the glass, but then you get corrosion of the metal components as well.
Wow.
But anyway.
So, yeah, well, that opens up a lot of exposure along this supply chain and the process of manufacturing, because not only do you have the growing medium and the environment with water and nutrients that you're putting into those potentials, but then what you're storing it in, what you're processing it in, and then when you're consuming it, storing it and then consuming
Right.
it every step of the way.
Every step of the way, Steve. Without trying to, make consumers that they're consuming your bad products. I think you have to be aware that the potential is there. Not that it's always going to happen, but you have to put a lot of thought into not only the cultivation and growing process, but the extraction and then the production and the delivery systems, because every step of the way there's the potential to absorb other heavy metals.
Yes, and this is a really major point that I want to bring out of this conversation is the, when I was buying cannabis before the medical program, I bought it where I could find it, where people would buy it in the illicit market.
Yes.
I doubt that they're investing in these controls to control.
Oh my gosh.
Heavy metal.
It's scary, really. No, they're not.
Yeah, so people are thinking, hey, they're concerned about, and I was in Maryland this past session with the legislators debating on pricing and taxes and how are we going to compete with this illicit market. And as opposed to just looking at the price per unit, like how much is an eighth of an ounce cost to the consumer, the risk of an untested product and the cost on health and the domino effect is a larger conversation. So to purchase a product for consumers, Robert, when someone is going to, because they're like you said, state by state, I've seen some products from other states that don't present a complete full panel analysis that does go into heavy metals. They may show you a potency test, which would show how many cannabinoids and terpenes, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So
absolutely.
What should we look for in buying a cannabis product to feel
Okay.
that we've been through this?
I've been amazed that if you look at the COA certificate of analysis of a multitude of products, and I talk to folks all over the country, not just here in Maryland, but every state is different. Some states just have a list of heavy metals, and it might just say pass. So it's not telling you what the level is. It's just pass. That's pointless, isn't it? I mean, that doesn't mean anything to an analytical chemist, and it shouldn't mean anything to a consumer. But you need to know what is the regulated limit. So, for example, in New York State, they regulate 9 heavy metals. I take my hats off to New York State, because they've at least expanded that list to go from 4 to 9. But the vast majority of the other states just regulate 4. So you need to know what the regulated limit is in that state, because it's different in every state, slightly different in every state. It's different for an inhaled product compared to a topical product, compared to an oral product. So you have to know, when it says pass, what does that mean? So here's the limit, and what did you find? So you really have to push the manufacturer, the producer, as to what that really means. And sometimes you don't even have heavy metal sort of information on a COA. And we're trying to, by talking to individual regulators and working with standards organizations, which I work with. It's a number of standards organizations in the industry, particularly ASTM, American Society of Testing Materials, AOAC, ACS. There's many standards organizations which can deliver a stronger message than myself. So I partner with those, and I've been responsible for developing a number of standards for cannabis through ASTM in particular. So all I ask consumers is be diligent, push your regulators for more information, because the part of the blame is the regulators. They're not doing enough to make the consumers aware of what a producer is not doing. And I understand that, the cannabis industry is huge in the US, and every state has to be aware of the revenue, and has to come up with realistic, meaningful regulations. But you've a state-based system where there's no oversight, so states can do basically what they want. And this is not meant to sound critical of state regulators, but then many of them are not scientists, so many of them don't understand the issues. So I try and help them. Some are interested in what I'm telling them, but others, they just, they how can I say, they're not paying great attention to what I'm telling them. But I think that's understandable. So
yeah, and there's a lot of things on their list, and everyone's overwhelmed with everything.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
and I understand the environment there. So looking at a COA, making sure that it's been tested thoroughly, not just a pass, but to get in there and look at the details and take the responsibility of when you select your product. And then the second part I wanted to ask about is the consumption. Like, so if you buy, and obviously the container. I mean, even though, is it safe to buy, cannabis flower if it's in a plastic container or in some of those plastic bags, or should we look for vendors that put them in glass, or is that not even?
Well, Steve, okay, through my publications, I get a lot of visibility. So people look to me to get a better understanding of the manufacturing process and what's used to store and deliver the product. So besides the cultivation and the extraction system, I published an article on the quality of stainless steel in the industry, and what the industry should be looking for, and what grade of stainless steel they should be using. I recently published one on glass, which got something like 20,000 views. So I know that people are listening to me, paying attention. I don't have a breakdown of who's looking. But then from that, I got questions about plastic containers. What do you know about plastic containers? So I'm in the process of doing research, and I will publish an article probably late June, early July on plastic containers and plastic bags, because that's an area which is not regulated whatsoever. And again, the pharmaceutical industry has very strict regulations on the quality of plastic bottles, plastic containers, plastic bags that are used in the pharmaceutical industry. So this is something the pharmaceutical industry pays strict attention to, and United States Pharmacopoeia has a number of chapters which address that. Obviously, with the cannabis industry, they're not there. So I'll be doing one on plastic containers and plastic bags within the next month or so.
Okay.
And I know, based on the glass one, I was surprised, because I knew that glass was widely used in the cannabis industry. But for example, one of the things that I uncovered was that small little dropper bottles, which have graduated marks on them, one of the studies found out that those graduated marks were lead paint, lead ink. So what was happening over time, and it was a CBD product, it wasn't in Maryland, it was another state, I won't say where it was, but they found out over time that the lead was leaching out of the ink. And the CBD, it was CBD oil, the CBD which was stored for longer. Okay, let me go back. The ones which were on the retailer shelves for longer had higher levels of lead, and I'm not talking about slightly over the level of 0.5 of ppm, but I'm talking about 20 to 30 times higher. And the study is ongoing, but they found out that the graduated ink was actually lead-based ink. And we know from household lead paint was banned in the US in 1978. So where are those graduated droppers coming from? Probably from overseas. I don't think US manufacturers would be allowed to use lead ink in their graduated droppers. I don't know, but having done a lot of work in the environmental space for the company I worked for, which looked at lead in paint, lead in gasoline, lead in industrial sites, we know that lead is by far the biggest contaminant of all the heavy metals, because anthropogenic activities over the years. So that's why
Yeah.
they banned gasoline. That's why they banned lead paint. So,
Yeah.
that's an example. The industry, there's no one looking, there's no oversight to say this shouldn't happen. We need to stop these dropper bottles coming into the US. If they are coming from overseas, I don't know. But that's something.
Yeah, most of them, I mean, as you can imagine, most of them are. And when no one's looking and you're a business owner and you're running, whether you have investors or shareholders or, focused on profits, price is always going to be, you're looking to cut.
I agree. I know. Yeah.
And then if no one's looking, then for most people, I use my own products. So I'm concerned about it. And obviously that I'm a small business. I don't have investors that I got to answer to. And
right. Yeah, sure.
so I understand the risks there. So containers, something to just be aware of, and really getting to know the person, the company that you're purchasing from.
Absolutely, yeah. Someone you can trust, someone who's not going to, be using this stuff. I mean, I know it's difficult not to use it because if you have a small business like yourself and you rely on these products, the stuff that's coming from overseas is typically lower cost than stuff you can purchase in the US. That's a sad state of affairs and a fact. So you have to be aware of that. So maybe sourcing your material from a place that you can trust.
Yeah, and that's the benefit of having a small business, at least because for us it's a longer term. We're not looking at razor thin margins and having to meet expectations of the street. For us it's a longer term business. So sure. I know sourcing these, even identifying where even if we look at places in Canada or onshore where we can have it, the price is a little bit more, and it's still the transparency of what's in the paint in the graduated dropper. These things a lot of times are hard to get. So the testing is
agree. Yeah.
So now let's take on to the other side of consuming cannabis. So obviously, if it's a product and if you're buying the flower, if you're going to smoke it, I know you have options of smoking. If you have a pipe, back in the day, we would pop the screens out of the sink and put it into the pipe and smoke it that way. Is there a risk in the screens? Is there like a copper screen? And then lighting that? Is there risk in burning?
Yeah, but I think the bigger risk is if you're consuming a liquid product. We know, for example, that people who vape dry flower, for example, there's less chance of corrosion of the metal components in a vaping system because you're talking about a dry flower, and there's less contact or less opportunity to create corrosion within those metal parts. But if you're talking about using high temperature, we know that some folks are really ramping the temperature up, whether it's a dry flower vape or a liquid vape. And when you start ramping the temperature up, and I've heard temperatures of 600 degrees Celsius. Oh my God!
Well, so when they do I think it's their dabs, or they use a blowtorch to heat up the element. I think it's glass they use. They blowtorch it, get it super hot. Yeah. They drop in.
So again, when you're elevating the temperature that high, the reaction kinetics are much different. I haven't studied that, and I haven't read any studies on it. But this is a whole bunch of stuff that I get questions on all the time. Sometimes I can help them. Sometimes I can just talk about reaction kinetics, a little bit about chemistry without getting too involved. But whenever you're using heat to elevate the temperature of your cannabis or your cannabinoid of choice, the opportunities are much, much higher for producing higher levels of heavy metals, which you could, inhale into your lungs. And we know, because there's been lots and lots of studies of looking at the aerosol in the aerosol, looking at the metal particles in the aerosol, depending on whether it's a dry flower or a liquid. We know the metal particles do get into the aerosol because you're using such high temperatures. So that's a fact of life. Yeah. So,
yes.
I think I think smoking cannabis is not something that I think, obviously, back in the early days, that was the main way of delivering, your cannabinoid. But I think you have to be aware that when there's high temperature involved, the chances of delivering a higher dose of heavy metal to you are much, much higher.
Yeah. Well, I've always thought when you're delivering medicine, your doctors don't really recommend smoking any medicine. It's
Right,
mostly
right.
ingesting it. So medicinally, eating it, tincturing it, sublingual, absorbing through the skin,
Yeah.
medicinally, you would just logically think that that's going to be better. And I'd love to dig a little deeper into probably another discussion, because we're getting close to the end here, about the vaping, because the vape technology is newer. It's meant to be a less harmful way of delivering any element, from nicotine to cannabis to other medicines. And it's very convenient because you have the disposable vapes that they sell. You can very little bit of odor. You can use it. You don't have to light anything. So consumers are really jumping on this vape cartridge thing, idea. But I notice, if you have a vape cartridge, the first time you use it, it starts to change color. The liquid will start off a light color, then as it gets down, it turns dark. And
Yeah. I've been asked that as well, and I don't know, because I haven't read any studies on it, but I think there's a good chance that there could be corrosion of, if brass is used in the device. I mean, brass would produce a yellowy tint to the liquid. Okay, stainless steel is used. Okay, nichrome. I mean, there's a number of metal components inside vaping devices. But it could just be oxidation of the cannabinoid and the whatever's in there, whatever's is used as a diluent oil. It could also be that.
All right. Well, so it sounds like there's still more research to be done, more studies to be done, more information to come out. Would love to have you back to talk about
Sure,
vaping
love to.
specifically,
Yeah.
as a method for consumption. But just as a consumer, Robert's got some really sound advice, which is just be reasonable and sensible about what you're consuming, especially if you're doing it every day. Once in a while, you can't prevent exposure to heavy metals. It's an earth element, but just be aware of what you're doing, and ask the right questions from the people that you're purchasing products from. Sounds like
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Okay, one last point to make is that most of the heavy metal regulations used in the cannabis industry have come from the pharmaceutical community. So the thing is that all pharmaceuticals have a maximum dosage per day. So the heavy metal regulations for pharmaceutical products are based on a dosage per day. It might be 1 gram, it might be 10 milligram, but we do not really know how much a typical cannabis consumer consumes per day. So even though the heavy metals regulations are derived from pharmaceutical products, you can't really apply them strictly to a cannabis consumer, because we have no way of knowing how much they're consuming every day. So that's the problem.
Okay, that's great. And one question, I think I forgot to ask you this, and then is there a way for me to identify if I have a high level of metals or heavy metals in my blood, in my system?
Heavy metals become a problem from long-term exposure. We know that based on the crisis in Flint, Michigan, where lead got into the drinking water supply, and I mean, for various reasons, but they were using the wrong pipes, and the drinking water was not treated correctly, and it was corroding the metal pipes. And what happens, for a number of years, people were consuming through their drinking water quite high levels of lead. So they've done some studies on people who lived in Flint, Michigan, particularly the children, and they found 5 to 10 times the typical sort of baseline level of lead in the population in the US. So they're studying these people to see what the long-term impact is. But we know the long-term impact of heavy metals like lead, mercury, arsenic, and cadmium, is more long-term. So you find that lead in particular, because it crosses the blood-brain barrier very easily, you get long-term, cognitive damage. That can be learning disabilities with children. So, but you never really know until it's too late. For example, there was a serious, mercury poisoning incident in Japan a number of decades ago, and what happened was that the population were consuming tuna, which was high in mercury, and those people who consumed these tuna fish over 10 years got to have these sort of telltale high mercury signs, sort of cognitive damage, symptoms, which were learning disabilities. And so we know based on that it's more long term than immediate. But we know based on leaded gasoline and leaded paint, that's why it was banned, is that there are many people in the US who have suffered from long term damage from lead poisoning. Yeah.
Is there a detox from it? Is there something like you can do regularly? Like, does it get out of the body through exercise, or is there some way to detox yourself from?
Yeah, if you catch it early enough, particularly, it's more a problem with children because they can absorb lead much easier than adults. Is they have to go in a hospital for what's called chelation treatment. They basically set up a drip, and over a couple of weeks, you have a chelating agent, which is typically EDTA, and I won't go into what EDTA is, but it's basically scavenging the heavy metals in your blood, and you excrete it out when you go to the bathroom. So that's quite a well-known method for detoxing children from lead in particular, but it would work with other heavy metals. But unfortunately, once it gets to such a high level and it's crossed the blood-brain barrier, there's very little you can do. So that's why heavy metals are so important, and that's why we have to make sure that there's not high levels of heavy metals in our diet, whether it's food or whether it's cannabis consumption.
Yeah, that's great. Well, great message. Anything else you wanted to mention today, Robert?
No, enjoyed our chat, and love to come back to talk about vaping devices, because I want
to talk about a lot of the stuff and the studies that you're doing moving forward, because I really think it would be beneficial to our audience and everyone. Apologize to you, Robert, for the beginning.
Oh, no problem.
Glitch I had here, and I apologize to anyone who thought that they were going to learn about heavy metal music today, like Iron Maiden or Metallica.
Well, we can talk about that later if you like.
We can.
Well,
okay. Hey, thanks, Robert. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thanks a lot, everyone.